Just a few days ago, on August 22nd, the UN-related Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, the IPC, declared officially that there is a famine in the Gaza Strip. Now, if you've been watching this channel for the last few months, you know that this is a lie, that this is a hoax. Ever since Hamas's invasion of Israel on October 7th, 2023, international organizations, UN-affiliated agencies, and the world media have relentlessly pushed what is basically a blood libel, a hoax, that Israel is deliberately starving the people of Gaza in headline after headline, and through official UN reports and viral images, the world has been told that Gaza is either on the brink of or already experiencing famine conditions. And in this video, we are going to go back to the beginning and lay out the entire hoax to show you exactly how the UN agencies and the world media have worked together to push this blood libel, to push this lie. So let's get right to it. Before we go on, make sure to go into the description of this video below and download the free ebook that is available there. This is a collection of columns that I've published over the course of the last year and a half since the beginning of the October 7th war. It gives you a feel for everything we've been through in this war. So go ahead and download that ebook. All the way back in December 2023, right at the beginning of the war, the IPC issued a projection that Gaza faced, quote, a risk of famine if the conflict and access conditions did not improve. Now, according to that report, already at that point, 378,000 Gazans, that's over 15% of the population, were, quote, in catastrophic IPC Phase 5. Now, Phase 5 is the phase that qualifies as officially famine. It's the most severe phase of the IPC's classification system. But here's the problem. One of the defining criteria for Phase 5 conditions is that 2 people out of every 10,000 are dying of malnutrition every single day. 2 out of every 10,000. In other words, at this point, if there were 378,000 Gazans experiencing Phase 5 famine conditions, there should have been 75 daily famine deaths in Gaza. We'll get back to that in a moment. At the end of February 2024, a few months later, the UN issued a press release declaring, quote, famine imminent in Gaza, humanitarian officials tell Security Council. This statement also declared an increase in the number of Gazans in Phase 5 conditions. Quote, at least 576,000 people in Gaza, 1/4 of the population, are, quote, one step away from famine. Then in March 2024, the IPC and FUSE again declared famine imminent in northern Gaza, again upping the number of Gazans who were declared at risk. According to CNN at the time, famine in northern Gaza is imminent as more than 1 million people face catastrophic levels of hunger, new report warns. Now, the March IPC report put the number of Gazans experiencing Phase 5 famine conditions at 677,000. Now, based on the criteria for this classification that we just mentioned, this would have meant that there should have been 135 Gazans dying of starvation every single day. But when the data actually came out, this all turned out to be a lie. According to Hamas's Ministry of Health figures, which are published by the World Health Organization in the 9 months between October 7th, 2023 and June 6th, 2024, not only were there not dozens or even over 100 starvation deaths every day, there was a total of 32 deaths from malnutrition in Gaza in that entire 9-month period. And according to a study by the UK Lawyers for Israel published in February 2025, even those deaths were largely attributed to intestinal infections and not hunger. This is according to Hamas's own health ministry information. In fact, despite the media headlines to the contrary, the total number of starvation and malnutrition deaths reported by the Gaza Health Ministry between October 2023 and the end of June 2025, just a few months ago, was still under 100. which is less than what the single day total should have been had the IPC Phase 5 classification been correct. Now, had the IPC predictions held true, there would have been tens of thousands of starvation deaths in 2024 alone. Now, in April 2024, the UN and the World Food Program again issued dire warnings. Quote, "We are getting closer by the day to a famine situation," said Giancarlo Siri, World Food Program Director in Geneva. Quote, "There is reasonable evidence that all three famine thresholds, food insecurity, malnutrition, and mortality, meaning 2 per 10,000 every day, will be passed in the next 6 weeks. The pattern continued. A month later, in May 2024, the Israeli government published data directly contradicting the IPC's claims. But in June and July of 2024, the media reports continued to cite a high risk of famine. But no one could point to actual data proving that famine had occurred. The famine never arrived, but the headlines kept coming. After months of warning of imminent and looming and risk of catastrophic famine, including official-sounding numbers attached to every prediction, in late June of 2024, the IPC issued a report titled Famine Review Committee Gaza Strip, June 2024. Now, this report was not widely reported. It showed that the previous famine predictions were not plausible, that they contradicted all the available data, and were based on incorrect assumptions. After months of worldwide media warning of famine in Gaza, the findings of this review committee report were barely covered by media outside of Israel. And yet, in that same month where that report came out that contradicted all of the warnings of famine, CNN reported at the time, quote, "Nearly 500,000 are projected to face catastrophic levels of hunger, the most severe level on the IPC scale. According to the report, 96% of the population of Gaza, more than 2 million people, will face crisis, emergency, or catastrophic levels of food insecurity through at least the end of September." Now, CNN conveniently left out the fact that the same report they were citing admitted that all of the previous famine predictions came up empty. Now, not to be deterred by the facts, the UN and its related agencies continued warning of impending or looming famine. Quote, "Food supplies to Gaza are dwindling as famine looms," warns UN, was the headline in the Financial Times on August 15th. And then in September, Victor Aguayo, the UNICEF Director of Child Nutrition, told journalists at the UN in New York that, quote, "The nutrition situation in Gaza is one of the most severe that we've ever seen," end quote. His statement was published by the UN with the accompanying headline, quote, "Risk of famine is real." On October 17th, 2024, the World Food Program and the IPC published another report which declared yet again that, quote, "Hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza risk famine this winter." And then in November, The Guardian reported that a committee of global food experts called the Famine Review Committee declared that there was a, quote, "strong likelihood that famine is imminent in areas of the northern Gaza Strip." But then, in December of 2024, after all of these warnings, FuseNet was forced to retract part of its predictions due to flawed population estimates. Now, there was no retraction in the media. They just published it quietly on the UN website. Instead, the world was left with the impression of ongoing, deliberate Israeli starvation policies. Even according to the UN's own reports, overwhelming evidence showed that there was no famine. In January and February of 2025, there were unprecedented quantities of food entering the Gaza Strip during the ceasefire during those months. And then the World Food Program website declared that, quote, "The surge in aid is pulling people back from the brink of starvation." You see what they're doing here? The food quantities are pulling people back from the brink of starvation, a starvation that, of course, never materialized. Now, regardless of the failure of all of these warnings of famine to come to fruition, the pattern of statements and headlines throughout 2024 that I've just laid out for you set the narrative in the minds of the world. There's famine in Gaza. Now, the warnings were always couched in language that allowed for plausible deniability. There was always a risk of an imminent or looming famine. The famine just never arrived. I mentioned earlier that one of the criteria for declaring Phase 5 famine conditions is that 30% of children are experiencing acute malnutrition as measured by mid-upper arm circumferences. Now, this was true until late June 2025. In a report on the Gaza Strip, the IPC moved the goalposts and they changed the rules. Instead of requiring 30% of children experiencing acute malnutrition, they now declared that it was sufficient to declare a famine if 15% of children were experiencing acute malnutrition if there is evidence of rapidly worsening underlying drivers. It's not clear what that evidence is, so this is a vague measure that leaves open a range of possibilities to justify declaring famine conditions. So what we have here is that the IPC moved the goalposts in order to perpetuate the famine in Gaza narrative. We shouldn't actually be surprised that there was no famine, considering the quantities of food that have been entering Gaza. According to the World Food Program, Gaza's population of 2.1 million people requires approximately 62,000 tons of food per month. The Coordinator of Government Activities in the Territories, COGAT, the Israeli body that oversees civilian affairs in Gaza, has meticulously tracked food aid volumes. They publish transparent and detailed reports. From March through December of 2024, 788,000 tons of food aid entered Gaza, an average of 78,000 tons per month. Now, that's more than 25% above what the World Food Program stated is necessary for the population of Gaza. On January 19th, 2025, right before the second hostage release ceasefire deal went into effect, humanitarian aid shipments surged. January saw 164,148 tons of food enter the Gaza Strip. That's more than twice the monthly average for 2024. February of 2025 was even higher, with a whopping 216,075 tons of food aid. Together, this 380,000 tons over January and February 2025 was enough to provide 5 months worth of food. That's through to the end of May at the levels of the previous 10 months. If we use the World Food Program requirement of 62,000 tons, the food from January and February was sufficient to last all the way through June. Now, it's important to note that these figures are not estimates. This is publicly available, verifiable numbers released by COGAT and monitored by international agencies. On March 2nd, with the ceasefire hostage release deal falling apart, Israel stopped allowing aid into Gaza. Now, despite the massive quantities of food that had just entered Gaza in the previous 2 months, within days of Israel closing the border, the starvation claims resumed. Already on March 19th, Turkey's state-run Anadolu agency ran the headline, quote, "Gaza officially enters first stage of famine amid Israeli blockade." And the UN, of course, wasn't far behind. On April 25th, UNRWA Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini declared, quote, "Children are starving in Gaza." And on April 28th, the UN's official website stated, quote, "Gazans face hunger crisis as aid blockade nears 2 months." And then in May, the BBC reported that, quote, "Gaza subjected to forced starvation, top UN official tells BBC." And then famously in late May, Tom Fletcher, head of the UN's Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, told BBC Radio that 14,000 babies in Gaza would die in the next 48 hours if Israel did not immediately resume allowing food into Gaza. While this claim was walked back by the UN, the narrative damage was done. There's a famine in Gaza. There's a famine in Gaza. Famine is looming. We heard it from late 2023 all the way in to March and April and May of 2025, despite the fact that the quantities of food being allowed into the Gaza Strip were more than enough to feed the population. So if food was entering the Gaza Strip in quantities that are well above the minimum necessary by the World Food Programme's measure, why was there any hunger in Gaza at all? But you already know the answer. Hamas has weaponized the humanitarian aid. Since the beginning of this war, Hamas has seized control of almost all of the aid that enters the Gaza Strip. So you see how this works. Even though UN agencies and the media report on the fact that Hamas takes control of the aid, they still persist in blaming Israel. Now, Hamas has a number of incentives to steal and withhold food from the civilian population. First and foremost, Hamas sells the food meant to be given to civilians at no charge. We've even reported in some of our videos, there are containers of food being sold in the marketplace, and on the label it says, not for sale. But Hamas sells the food and they sell it to fund their continued operations. The estimate is that Hamas has made approximately $500 million from sales of stolen humanitarian aid. Hoarding aid also keeps the prices high by limiting the supply available for purchase on the street. High prices are also necessary for the success of the information warfare, because if the prices would drop, it would be very hard to convince the world that there is any starvation going on. Late May 2025 saw the inauguration of a new system for distribution of aid, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. We've discussed it in a number of videos on this channel. Operating 4 sites currently in the southern and central Gaza Strip, the GHF is an American project operating in close coordination with Israel. The purpose of the GHF is to deliver food aid directly to individual Gazans while bypassing Hamas-controlled distribution networks. The GHF operates with a high level of logistical transparency, tracking the aid deliveries with barcodes and GPS to ensure that the food reaches its intended recipients and not Hamas. According to a detailed report on the GHF from the beginning of August 2025 by Andrew Fox of the Henry Jackson Society, within a few weeks of starting operations on the ground in Gaza, the GHF was already delivering up to 2.5 million meals per day directly to Gazan civilians. By mid-July, the cumulative meals delivered surpassed 52 million over approximately 5 to 6 weeks, and by the end of July, this figure was even higher. The GHF reported over 100 million meals delivered by late July. The success of the GHF, which circumvented Hamas's control of the aid, was not only a threat to Hamas's grip on the humanitarian aid, it was also a threat to the UN agencies that had proven so ineffective in ensuring that the aid was safely and reliably distributed directly to the people. The GHF exposed the fact that the narrative that Israel was causing hunger in Gaza was false. Hamas responded with threats and then violence. They threatened Gazans not to go to the sites and not to cooperate. They also threatened the GHF themselves. They also attacked distribution centers and intimidated aid recipients. Then the GHF has come under fire, literally, from Hamas and some local clans loyal to Hamas. They've even murdered Gazans who were working for the GHF. While Hamas is attacking the GHF, the UN and its agencies have been pressuring Israel to shut down the GHF and go back to delivering aid only through UN-related organizations. At the same time as they were demanding that the GHF be shut down, a disinformation campaign was launched by Hamas and the UN with near-daily false claims in international media that the IDF is shooting Gazans coming to the GHF distribution sites. There is even a locked, uneditable Wikipedia page titled 2025 Gaza Strip Aid Distribution Killing rulings, which reports as fact that, quote, since the 27th of May 2025, amid a famine in the Gaza Strip, more than 1,965 Palestinian civilians seeking aid have been killed and thousands more have been wounded in the Gaza Strip when being fired upon by the IDF, armed gangs and contractors hired by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. This is a lie. In late June and early July of 2025, major international media outlets, including the BBC and PBS and others, reported on claims made by a GHF contractor named Tony Aguilar, who alleged that he had witnessed war crimes and indiscriminate use of force by IDF soldiers and GHF contractors at distribution sites. But the GHF pushed back. And they pointed out that Aguilar had been fired on June 13th for poor performance, erratic behavior, and volatile conflicts with staff. The GHF also presented evidence that Aguilar had fabricated and backdated documents to support his claims. Now, even though the evidence of Aguilar's lies were revealed to the media, legacy media outlets uncritically reported his quote-unquote testimony as if it were an unbiased report by a courageous whistleblower. Now, the idea that the IDF would shoot at civilians collecting aid from distribution sites that the Israelis themselves helped to set up is absurd on its face. Israel's entire strategic goal in facilitating the GHF's aid delivery is to separate the daily needs of Gazans from Hamas and from areas under Hamas control. Why would the IDF attack Gazan civilians coming to the distribution sites they set up? It makes no sense. The daily claims of deaths from IDF gunfire always come from staff at Hamas-controlled hospitals or from unverified eyewitness testimonies. There has yet to be even a single video clip showing IDF soldiers firing at civilians coming to collect aid at these sites. If it was true that IDF soldiers actually killed a single civilian at an aid distribution site, there would be some visual evidence to support this claim. In July 2025, it was widely reported that close to 1,000 truckloads of food aid that had already been allowed into Gaza were sitting untouched, waiting for UN-affiliated contractors to pick it up. The quantity of food sitting out in the sun was enough to feed Gaza for multiple weeks. When the UN agencies claimed that there were logistical problems or security problems picking up the food, the GHF offered to help, but the UN refused the offer. See, Hamas and the UN agencies work together. This tactic of Hamas of starving the civilian population in Gaza for political gain should not surprise us. Just as Hamas places rocket launchers in schools and stores weapons in hospitals, it also hoards food and obstructs the aid, not letting it get to the people in order to cause greater suffering. The reports of hungry children and the exorbitant prices in the Gaza Strip over the last few months are meant to incite international outrage against Israel. But perhaps the most manipulative aspect of the entire starvation hoax is the use of sick children in media campaigns. For example, the case of Wateen Abu Amuna, featured by the BBC. Photos showed this infant wrapped in a garbage bag with claims that there were no diapers or formula available. But there are other videos that show the same baby being bottle-fed and wearing diapers, and the mother appeared healthy. Then there's the case of Osama al-Rakab. The Italian newspaper Il Fatto Quotidiano published a front-page photo of what looks like a severely malnourished child. The accompanying story included an interview with Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories. Albanese accused the Italian government of being complicit in what she called Israel's starvation policy. It turns out, though, that the child in question suffers from cystic fibrosis and has been in Italy undergoing medical treatment since early June. The picture was taken in April and ran on the front page in late July. But the most celebrated case of deception using sick children is that of Mohammed al-Matouk. Al-Matouk was featured in the New York Times, portrayed as a victim of famine. He actually suffers from a severe genetic disorder. A tightly cropped photo of the emaciated boy lovingly held in his mother's arms went viral and created the iconic picture of starvation in Gaza, even though the boy's condition had nothing to do with food shortages. Later, when the full uncropped photo leaked, Mohammed's obviously well-fed brother was seen standing next to him, appearing completely healthy. Now, the New York Times ran the deceptive photo on its front page and was seen, of course, by tens of millions of people. But the retraction admitting their error was posted only on the New York Times PR X account, which has less than 100,000 followers. Dr. John Borowski is a humanitarian physician who has worked in refeeding centers in refugee camps and rural hospitals in war and in peace in Kenya, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and India. He's an expert in famine conditions, and he recently pointed out that real famine conditions look dramatically different from what we're seeing coming out of Gaza. In Dr. Borowski's field experience, famine results in, quote, hundreds of malnourished children, not isolated cases. By contrast, the images coming out of Gaza consistently show individual sick kids whose conditions are more consistent with chronic illness, like the examples we just shared, than they are with starvation. In Borowski's own words, quote, the regular photos of masses of children show kids that look miserable and dirty, but not at all malnourished. You can look at their average mid-upper arm circumference and see that it's okay. Many adults seem to even be overweight. When food is scarce, everyone gets skinny. Also, pictures of an individual child with an abnormal MUAC have been used to prove malnutrition, but 3% of normal, well-fed kids have abnormal MUAC. So this is deliberate disinformation. Borowski goes on to point out that the latest Hamas-sourced death toll from malnutrition reports twice as many adults as children dying from malnutrition. This makes absolutely no sense. 2/3 of famine deaths should be children in any famine, especially in such a young population where 50% of the population is under the age of 18. What Dr. Borowski is pointing out is if there were actual famine in the Gaza Strip, there would be wards of sick children dying of starvation. The adults would also be emaciated and starving, and we're not seeing that. What we're seeing instead is individual isolated cases using sick children to distort the reality. To sum up, for nearly 2 years, the world has been bombarded with claims of looming or imminent starvation in Gaza. But the facts, the number of deaths, the quantities of food, the eyewitness accounts, and even the UN's own official reports have shown that there is no famine in Gaza. What there is a concerted effort by the United Nations and its agencies and world media to demonize Israel. Famine in Gaza is a hoax.